It was June 3rd, 1922. The previous day, 2 white men had been shot and killed by a black man in the rural community of Simsboro, Texas. An armed white mob gathered at the turnoff to the only road into the small town. Groups of armed black men waited for them, behind trees and bushes on both sides of the road, ready to attack. This imminent race war was the crescendo in a series of horrors that began in Freestone County a month earlier. But how did it get to this point? How did this peaceful rural farming community with no history of racial violence become the epicenter of racial tensions in the United States? It started on an innocent Thursday, May 4th, 1922, a day forever etched in the memory of Little Curven, Texas. This one-time boomtown, nestled in Freestone County, buzzed with anticipation. School had just ended, and graduation was the next morning. Eula Ausley, a young woman with dreams as vast as the Texas sky, had recently accepted Lawton Smith's proposal of marriage and was about to be the first member of her family to graduate high school. Skilled with a needle, her Aunt Rena meticulously sewed a beautiful white graduation dress for her. Anticipation buzzed through Curven like a restless hive.
She was a very sweet girl. Everybody loved Eula. She had a real good personality. She was, and those king men worshipped her, really did.
All I know is the girl was going to school at Curven. She would have graduated the next day. Would have spent the night in Curven, but she had to go home and get her graduation dress.
But fate had other plans. Eula came home from school every day at 4 o'clock, but when she did not arrive by 4:30, her grandfather, town patriarch John King, sensed something was amiss. He sent a trusted farmhand, Ben Gibson, to look for her, and he found her horse tied to a bush, its saddle empty.
She was horseback. Started across this, I guess it was kind of a ditch, or they had to go down in it. It wasn't a bridge. These guys jumped up and caught hold of her horse, stopped, and she wasn't afraid of them because they worked for her grandpa. And the next thing we knew, they had everybody out looking for her.
King telephoned his sons, and a search party of concerned citizens began scouring the countryside for Eula. They retraced her steps, and beside a small stream known as Grindstone Creek, they found a scene that would soon unravel the entire community. A member of the search party, J.C. Watley, described how he and a local doctor named Whiteside stumbled on the gruesome scene.
Dr. Whiteside and me went down there, and we got out of his car, and we just started out. We saw something over there, and there she lay, and her head was beat in the ground till it was just flat across, a hole in the ground that big around where they beat her head into that ground. We put out the alarm right quick, and John T. and Dr. Whiteside and me carried her up and laid her on the back porch of an old house. I held the flashlight, examined her, but they taken an old knotted stick, just jobbed her till they just tore all the pieces inside.
Near a footbridge over the creek, they found Eula's lifeless body. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her throat cut, her tongue sliced out, and her head stomped into the ground. Particularly shocking, she had been sexually mutilated with a knotted length of rough cedar. Footprints showed that at least 3 men had committed the crime. The sight affected the minds of the searchers in the manner that music can shatter glass. Early the next morning, search parties were formed, fueled by rage and grief. They were determined to find the guilty party. However, when it was reported that bloodhounds were being flown in from nearby Huntsville, one of the searchers unexpectedly and hurriedly left the posse and headed for his home. His name was McKinley "Snap" Curry, and he was a black man who worked for the King family. When searchers arrived at his home, Snap's wife admitted that he had come home the previous evening wearing clothes covered in blood. He then disappeared into the nearby woods. He immediately became the prime suspect. After a 6-hour chase, Curry was captured by another black man on a farm road just outside of nearby Wortham, Texas. Lacking a sufficient jail cell, he was placed in the vault of the Wortham State Bank.
Standing inside the vault of the Wortham Bank, Wortham, Texas, I was here in May of 1922, and it was this vault where we believe Snap Curry was brought after Snap had run away from the search mob in Curvin, Texas, after they had found blood on his clothes at his house and had identified him as one of the murderers of Eula Ausley. From this bank vault, Sheriff Horace Mayo came over from Fairfield and took Snap out, we believe through a window, and tried to make a run for it, tried to get Snap to Waco so that the lynch mob would not catch him. But the lynch mob called ahead, they blockaded the road, and Sheriff Mayo was forced to take Snap to the jail in Fairfield.
We're in the alley behind the Wortham Bank building where Snap Curry was taken by the sheriff as the mob gathered in front. As you can see, the outline of this window here has been bricked up. At that time, though, we believe that this would have been accessible to the rear of the bank where the vault is located and would have allowed the sheriff to get him out without being seen by the mob.
Mayo's road to Waco was blocked, and he rerouted to the Freestone County Jail in Fairfield, which was also the residence of Mayo's family. At some point during the trip, Curry supposedly implicated 2 other black men in the crime, Mose Jones and Johnny Cornish, who were also delivered to the jail in Fairfield. A mob of more than 500 formed outside the jail. They broke in and carried the 3 black men back to Curvin. Wood and fuel were gathered, and there in a vacant lot between the Methodist and Baptist churches, each of the 3 was stripped, castrated, and then, one at a time, burned alive.
They just drug in some big old break-in plows, you know, the kind that you put 2 or 3 teams of horses to, up there right by where the, I guess it's more or less kind of from church. And they tied them to them and burned them up. Yeah, they burned them alive.
Dawn on May 6th revealed a smoldering pile of wood and debris around the riding plow. A photographer from nearby Mahia arrived and took a series of photos. More fuel was poured on the pyre and set ablaze. Dozens of spectators, some wearing their Sunday finest, watched until the embers cooled, then rummaged through the ashes to find body parts for souvenirs. The horror should have been over. It was not. The next day, a black man named Shadrack Green was found hanging from a tree. Rumors of armed black men descending on Curvin from Dallas circulated, and people prepared for battle. No black mob ever arrived, but white rage was not satiated. Over the next few days, an unknown number of blacks were killed. One was forced to dig his own grave and was then shot. Another was pursued by a group of white men on horseback. When he tried to hide in an outhouse, the riders peppered it with bullets until the unfortunate man fell out, dead. The sheriff of neighboring Navarro County, Walter Hayes, stated in 1966 that there was at least 20, could have been more. A bunch of niggers got together and signed an agreement not to work for whites. Every last one of them was hunted down and hung.
I doubt if the killing would have stopped if the Rangers hadn't come in. Still hunting and killing anyone they thought that might even had something to do with it. Figured, well, the niggers was gonna come and raid the town. They lynched some of them, but I knew of the burning downtown, but they said they lynched. I don't know how many, but they said they lynched some of them.
Black people were afraid to be seen during the day and were afraid to sleep in their homes at night. Some kept their houses dark, and others slept outside in pastures for fear of being shot through an illuminated window. Some hid out in nearby creek bottoms. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, packed their meager possessions and fled, never to return.
Most of the colored people left there, Steve. After this all happened, this many of them were killed. They just drifted away.
Many of the whites committing the assaults were not local. Newspapers reported that as many as 2,000 men came in from places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Corsicana, and Houston to participate in the violence. Whites who were local had varying reactions. Some were proud of what had been accomplished, some were amused, and some were disgusted and ashamed. Perhaps the most common and counterintuitive reaction was fear. Just as antebellum slave owners were terrified of servile insurrection, like those that were led by Nat Turner, whites of the 1920s worried that blacks living under Jim Crow would finally decide that enough was enough and revert to violence. In and around Curvin following the lynchings, residents concluded that they were about to become targets for retaliation. Whereas scared blacks sheltered in dark houses, scared white families insisted on keeping every light in their homes turned on at night. Rumors ran rampant that mobs of armed black men were descending onto Curvin from Dallas and other places in the north. People prepared both by arming themselves and by doing what they could to protect their loved ones. No black mobs ever arrived. Regardless, the rage that engulfed many whites was not satiated. Klan activity, relatively non-existent in the area before the Troubles, mushroomed. In addition to hunting down black victims, Klansmen held huge rallies and recruited hundreds of new members. Newspaper editors published reassurances that what had been done was not only justified, but was praiseworthy and necessary. The proud men and women of the King family coped as well as they could with their grief, keeping mostly to themselves.
Yeah, I remember my dad would bring the axe in the house at night. Every kind of thing to use for protection. We heard that all of the black people were coming down on the train one certain day, but I don't know when. But I know my dad was in town, and my brother and I were hoeing cotton or corn or something, and he happened to think about we were down there by Cedar Creek doing this, hoeing this little patch of corn, and he come home.
Eula was buried in the white dress her grandmother made for her graduation. Her large gravestone identified her as Eula King instead of Ausley and was inscribed, "She was too good, too gentle and fair, to dwell in this cold world of care." Tension in the county remained high, with new shocking rumors circulating daily. Still, an explanation for what had happened and why it happened became accepted. The three men who were burned, as well as Shadrach Green, had all worked for John King at one time. The people of the town believed that the King men, particularly Otis, had treated blacks cruelly, beating them if they did not plow straight enough, pick enough cotton, or act sufficiently respectful. In turn, the three black men plotted revenge, and Eula's murder was the result. It was a narrative that was not based on any documented history, but it would serve the community for many decades to help assuage any remnant feelings of white guilt.
And I think if Mr. King hadn't mistreated those guys, it wouldn't have never happened either. He just mistreated them. I always heard. Now, I don't know how true it was. It was because of the fact that they had burned these guys, and they were going to come in, and I guess.
I understand what I've heard, that the King men were pretty domineering with their black people that worked for them. And they thought that would be the best way to get revenge on them because this girl's mother was already deceased.
A few weeks after Eula's murder, the King family got a surprise knock at their door. After all the other newspapers had moved on to other stories, a reporter named Dan Kelly from Waco, Texas, decided to give the story a second look. Things just didn't add up. There were some missing pieces to the narrative going around Curvin, and he was determined to find them, and find them he did. His conversation with John King turned this entire story on its ear. Nothing was as it seemed, and everything they thought they knew was about to change. Daniel Kelly did work for a newspaper, but it was not located in Texas. Although he was born in Taylor and grew up in Waco, he had been residing in New York City since he graduated with a degree in engineering from the University of Texas in Austin. His employer in 1922 was the newspaper The Newark Ledger. It is still unclear how a Texas-educated engineer ended up working for a New Jersey newspaper. He was also, at least temporarily, an investigator for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. He was, for all practical purposes, a secret agent. He came to Curvin for the express purpose and at the bidding of the NAACP. Kelly was the perfect person for the job. He was quickly accepted by the local people in Curvin, including John King. They welcomed Dan into their homes as a fellow Texan. Founded in 1909, the NAACP was quite adept at investigating lynchings. And this was the first triple live burning in the United States since their founding. Kelly was sent to Kirvin by famed civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson, secretary of the NAACP. Johnson was a multifaceted American figure known for his contributions as a writer, civil rights activist, educator, lawyer, diplomat, and composer. Dan Kelly wrote a letter to Johnson of his plan.
Dear Mr. Johnson, tomorrow or Tuesday I shall go to Kirvin. I have letters of introduction promised me to the county officials there. I am inclined to believe that the evidence will cast grave doubt on the guilt of at least 2 victims. When I secure more facts, I shall write again. No one questions my interest in the questions I inquire about. I am taken for granted. Well, Dan, how did you like those damned Yanks is their first query. Sincerely, Dan Kelly.
While they chatted, Grandfather King gazed at his only portrait of Eula. He then, surprisingly, proceeded to tell a very different story about why Eula had been murdered. And by whom. The story that Grandfather King told Dan Kelly was about a white family named Prowl that lived on a farm adjoining the King property that Eula rode past every day coming home from school. Relations between the 2 families was strained because of a quarrel that happened 2 years before. The quarrel was over a cattle deal. 2 of the Prowls jumped one of King's sons and cut him with a knife, maiming him for life. Tom Prowl, the family patriarch, was livid. He swore revenge. He wanted to make John King hurt where it hurts most. So when Eula came up missing, King immediately suspected the Prowl family was involved. Grandfather King's suspicions were not just his own. Sheriff Mayo noticed 3 sets of footprints had been left at Eula's murder scene, and they led to an abandoned house owned by the Prowl family. Inside, the sheriff found and arrested brothers Claude and Audie Prowl. He brought them to the Fairfield jail where they spent the night. They were still in the jail when the white mob broke in and carried the 3 black men back to Kirvin, and ultimately a fiery death. The Prowl brothers claimed that the reason their footprints were in the area where Eula was killed was because they had been making moonshine nearby. However, by the time anyone could investigate this claim, the 3 black men had been killed and the community had closed ranks around the story that they, and only they, had been Eula's murderers. Sheriff Mayo quietly released the Prowl brothers and told them to never set foot in the county again. The Prowl brothers did just that. In fact, even though Patriarch Tom Prowl had spent his entire life in Kirvin, he up and moved the entire family to Oklahoma within days of the murder. By mid-July of 1922, a mere 6 weeks after Eula's murder, the Prowls were so far removed from Kirvin that Audie Prowl and his younger sister Lila were featured in their new church program as scripture readers. While the Prowls were settling into their new lives as Oklahomans, Freestone County was still reeling from what came to be known as the Troubles. Suspicion of the Prowl brothers was not a secret. They were arrested by Sheriff Mayo before the 3 black men were captured. Although early reporting was spotty and somewhat inaccurate, mention of 2 white men being involved was included in the earliest reporting from newspapers starting on the day after the murder. By the next day, May the 6th, the Prowl brothers were being named as suspects in many newspapers. Due to a mistake by the Associated Press, their name was misspelled as Crowell instead of Powell. This simple error may have allowed for them to go undetected for many years in the future. In all, Claude and Audie were mentioned in 45 different newspapers around the country, but only 2 in Texas, in the cities of Port Arthur and Taylor. The story did not run in any newspaper in the area where anyone would have known who the Prowl family was. Eula's story was the 1920s version of going viral. Her name had over 1,000 mentions in newspapers. The story ran in almost all the states and was carried as far away as Australia and Canada. Many papers ran multiple follow-up stories. For a few weeks, Freestone County was the center of the universe, in a very bad way. Horace Mayo, who had only recently won his first ever election, constantly found himself the center of attention. He did not always handle it well. His story changed, and he distributed justice unevenly. He stood up to the Ku Klux Klan, who were seizing the opportunity to make their presence known, but caved in to a narrative that he secretly felt was not true. At times, the moment seemed to be too big for him, and the community noticed. Horace Mayo was the sheriff of Freestone County for only one term, but it was 2 years of hell. Even before Eula's murder and its aftermath, the battle with moonshiners and bootleggers caused the governor to declare martial law in the county. Amidst it all, the choir-singing, church-going, family-loving Mayo killed at least 2 men, and maybe a third. One of the men killed by Mayo, according to people living near Curvin at the time, happened when white men were killing every black man they found in the weeks following the Troubles. Supposedly, Sheriff Mayo drove up as a black man was being hanged by an angry white mob. Having already failed to protect black men from other white mobs, Mayo took a different approach. As the unfortunate man was dangling from a noose, strangling, the sheriff took out his pistol and shot the man.
Horace Mayo killed the guy when they were just killing everyone they could find. Here in Fairfield, Dad drove up on the old Fairfield Road, and there was one hanging from a tree. Might have been a week or two, I don't know. The Dad said that when they was hanging this nigger between the street, that he just drove up and got out and shot the guy, killed him. Didn't go through the punishment they was putting him through. I think they tried to put every black guy they could catch through the same problem she went through.
On June 1st, 1922, a young man named Leroy Gibson went to Curvin to visit his girlfriend. He was the son of Ben Gibson, who worked for Grandfather King, and who was the first man sent to look for Eula on May 4th. Leroy may have believed his connection to the King family afforded him protection from the white anger still simmering in the community. It did not. He was arrested. Leroy resisted, broke free, and made a run for it. Shots were fired, and he was hit in the leg, but he kept running, or limping, away toward the community of Simsboro 9 miles away. Simsboro was populated by several black families who attended the Mount Pleasant Church there. The community was so isolated, with no electricity or telephones, that its inhabitants were unaware of the murder and lynchings that had occurred weeks earlier in Curvin.
That was the house to which Allie Gibson walked from Curvin after he had been shot in the leg. It's about 9 miles. And he walked all this distance, spent the night with his grandparents, and the next day, a group of white men, at least 7 of them, and maybe more, came, having chased or tracked Allie from Curvin. And the house behind us is where Letitia Gibson lived as a young girl. And I interviewed her at that same site in the 1990s. And she recalled seeing white men coming across the field, seeing the sun glinting off their rifles, and going up to the Gibson house, bringing Allie out, laying him down on the ground somewhere in this area, and shooting him into doll rags. I believe it would have been his uncle, Leroy, then ran out of the house with a rifle, and one of the white mob shot and killed him as well. After which Floyd Gibson, another uncle to Allie, who was a World War I veteran, came out, picked up the rifle that Leroy had dropped, laid down on the ground, and began shooting the white men as they fled. Killed 2 of them. Actually, one of them died en route to the hospital. The other one died in the hospital.
Allie was shot in the yard of the house. The house had a barbed wire fence around and had a gate. And when Allie came out of that gate, that man shot him. So Leroy was shot down behind the house, in the field. They took him out in the field. We were in there at the house. We was out in the yard. Okay. We wasn't working that day. I was 13. I was good size. We just didn't know what was going on. And we just stood there and looked. He was standing on the back porch behind his mother. His mother had just stopped begging this same man, imagine, please don't shoot my son, please don't shoot my son. But she talked him off and he left. And they thought everybody was gone. And my brother Adam took his rifle and he said, I'm going down to see about mama now.
That's his grandmother.
And that's when they shot him down. But they'd kill Leroy and my brother was shooting. We could see them running.
According to a statement issued by Freestone County officials, they were ambushed after they came to the Gibson house. These officials claim Leroy Gibson had confessed to participating in the assault and murder of Eula Ausley before he was killed. The confession was highly suspect. Wild rumors circulated throughout that night through 3 Texas counties and were responsible for the more than 2,000 heavily armed white men who came to Simsboro and Curvin the next day. Police Chief Sam Allen of Mexia came to Simsboro with 4 automobiles loaded with deputized citizens and regular officers. Mexia Mayor J.I. Riddle had arranged with local hardware stores to furnish guns and ammunition to whites. The exact number of whites and Negroes involved in what was termed by officers as an uprising could not be determined, although it was reported to be a good many. By this point, many blacks of Freestone County had gathered at the Gibson house. After a month of violent attacks, they decided it was time to take a stand. They were also heavily armed and were preparing for an attack. They lined both sides of the one road that goes through Simsboro, hiding behind bushes and trees. It was shaping up to be an extremely brutal and deadly event. When tensions reached their peak, a strange trio of men, Sheriff Mayo, Texas Ranger Manny Gonzalez, and prominent farmer, Carter Sessions, arrived at the scene. Gonzalez was a notable Texas Ranger, known for his strict law enforcement and significant contributions to public safety in Texas. He joined the Texas Rangers in 1920 and later became famous for his work in taming lawless oil boom towns during the Great Depression. Gonzalez was known for his fearless approach. Records show that more well-known Texas Rangers like Frank Hamer had come earlier in the saga to keep the peace, but this time Gonzalez came alone, which was befitting of his nickname, the Lone Wolf. Gonzalez and Hamer reached their pinnacle of fame a decade later when they gunned down famous bank robbers Bonnie and Clyde. This episode was chronicled in the 2022 film, The Highwayman. At the general store, Carter Sessions, known well in the community as a prominent farmer and an original pioneer in Freestone County, took the lead in talking to the white mob. He was overheard saying, 90% of Curvin wants the Rangers to come here and settle this mess. It's an outrage and a nuisance. I am not defending the Negroes. The murder of the Ausley girl was an atrocious crime, and the burning of the 3 Negroes was just, but it should stop now. If a white man had been accidentally killed here last night, 50 Negroes would have been exterminated. Gonzalez was also successful talking to the blacks lining the road. No one knows for sure exactly what he said, but he talked them into going back towards the Gibson home and assured them that no harm would come to them. Gonzalez then went into Curvin and shut down all the bars for the evening. Even though the blacks did retreat, they didn't fully believe Gonzalez. The next day, Sessions went into the black community. He later said that, I went there to make an investigation of the whole affair. No one was in sight and I shouted that I was a federal agent. Negro men, women, and children came creeping out of the brush and on their knees and with tears in their eyes.
Of course, then most of the colored people left there, Steve. After this all happened, as many of them were killed, they just drifted away. So that's one thing brought Curvin down.
After that harrowing night in Simsboro, the blacks had had enough. After a full month of lynchings, violence, intimidations, and relationships strained beyond repair with their white neighbors, most decided it was time to go. Very quietly and with very little fanfare, they packed up their meager belongings and left the area, never to return. A meeting of the town fathers occurred in an attempt to end the violence once and for all, but it was too late. The vast majority of black families were gone, and there was no way to get them back. Suddenly, a realization came over all that remained. Harvest season was less than 1 month away, and the majority of their workforce had just left town. But even before this new reality could set in, this little Texas town would be cast into the national spotlight one more time. In 1922, The NAACP was heavily involved in advocating for the Dyer anti-lynching bill. This bill, introduced by Representative Leo Dyer, aimed to make lynching a federal crime. The NAACP supported this legislation as part of its broader campaign against racial injustice and violence. The bill successfully passed the House of Representatives in January, but faced significant opposition in the South, where senators wanted to keep this from becoming law and wanted it to just quietly go away. Those wishes were dashed in May of that year, when lynchings dominated the news, and none garnered more headlines than the lynchings in Curvin, Texas. The efforts of the NAACP brought national attention to the issue of lynching, and no case was more important than this one. On May the 8th, just 3 days after the lynching, James Weldon Johnson reached out to Representative Dyer.
To the Honorable Representative Leo Dyer, we are undertaking investigation. The latest dispatch states that 2 white men are being held at Tig, Texas, in connection with the murder of a girl for which 3 Negroes were burned. We feel this is an important clue and one which we will follow. Agree with you that 2 of the men were certainly not guilty and in grave doubt on guilt of the other. Any further facts obtained will be telegraphed to you. James Weldon Johnson, Secretary.
Johnson later reached out directly to the President of the United States.
To the Honorable Warren G. Harding, President of the United States, Washington, D.C., the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, on behalf of 1 million colored Americans, respectfully request a federal investigation of what we are convinced are serious disorders in Texas, in the environs of Curvin, and the dispatch of federal troops there if necessary to protect the lives of American citizens. To date, 5 colored men have been lynched, 3 of them burned at the stake, for alleged complicity in a crime of which there is the gravest doubt that any of them was guilty. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People respectfully urges immediate investigation to determine whether general conditions are not cause of present disturbances, rather than the single crime for which 5 men have already paid with their lives. James Weldon Johnson, Secretary.
There was an urgency to the Curvin case. Dan Kelly arrived in Curvin on May 17th to begin his investigation, and the NAACP was going to have its annual convention a month later on June 18th. Dan Kelly most certainly had his work cut out for him. Newspapers across the country were waiting to find out the real details of this important story. Because of its gruesome nature, Johnson really wanted to highlight this case at the convention. After wrapping up his investigation, Kelly had just a few weeks to prepare and present his findings. He was scheduled to tell this horrid tale on June 23rd at the Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. Other people presented other stories at this convention and other speeches were given, but no tale was more anticipated or more riveting than the one to be told by the little reporter from Taylor, Texas. He stepped up to the microphone and began speaking to a dead quiet audience, riveted to his every word.
At the request of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, I undertook to investigate as clearly, as candidly, and as thoroughly as I could the actual facts and circumstances surrounding the lynching of 3 Negroes at Curvin, Texas, on May 6th, and later the hanging of a 4th and the unexplained disappearance of a 5th, all growing out of the alleged attack and murder of a 17-year-old girl. I believe I can say that the things I say to you are based upon a candid examination of the evidence that I was able to secure by speaking to more than 100 people, talking to the sheriff, and many of those who proudly proclaimed that they had taken part in the burning.
Kelly spoke for the better part of an hour, regaling the tale of Curvin, Texas, and the conversations he had with the people there. He spoke of his conversations with Eula's grandfather that were 3 weeks apart, but he looked like he had aged 10 years. Kelly then concluded his remarks.
It would seem to me that the people of the communities that I visited are utterly ignorant and unconcerned with the fact that there is such a thing as a race problem in these communities. They are utterly unconcerned with the fact that half the population is denied, for all practical purposes, political suffrage, the right to education, the right to own property. That their civil rights, their personal rights, are denied on any and every occasion. That discrimination of every kind is exercised against them. It has always been that way, and so far as they can see, it will probably always be that way. So it would seem to me that whatever solution there is of the race question in the South and in the North, it is not going to be solved by the white people. It has got to be taken up and handled by the Negro himself. As far as I can see, There is no hope that the white people of the South will even give the Negro any assistance in solving the race problem or in securing to himself even the physical rights of his civil liberty and personal security. And it seems to me that more than petitioning, legislation will have to be pursued in order to secure these rights. The Negro in the South and in the North must be educated or in some way aroused to a willingness to maintain, with whatever force is necessary, his personal dignity, his civil rights, and the defense of his life.
Kelly's words rang of someone having a great epiphany, but he wasn't telling the people in attendance anything they didn't already know. Things were bad for black people in Texas and almost everywhere else in the country, and they would not improve anytime soon. The Great Depression was just 7 years away, and that would only add to their plight. But the plight of Curvin, Texas began much sooner. It actually began right away. Things deteriorated quickly. The lynchings and the unwanted national attention took their toll immediately. Harvest season was a disaster. The mayor and all of the town's aldermen resigned within a few weeks. In November, the biggest bank closed up shop for good. And soon after that, the fires started.
My house is burned, but I don't know where they burned it. Not Paul Norman house burned. And the old Myers place burned. That was right there, right on the block, right close to a blacksmith shop. There's 2 blacksmith shops there at one time. Grist mill there one time, and the kick show there on Saturday afternoon. My brother had a pool hall there.
It was because of the fact that they had burned these guys. I don't know, but I know it was a ruination of Kurt. The downfall of the little bird here.
Of all the people who suffered after the Troubles, arguably no one suffered more than Sheriff Horace Mayo. When the lynch mob formed in Wortham, while Snap Curry was imprisoned in a bank vault, Mayo tried to save him from the mob but failed. In December 1922, when another mob formed to lynch another black man, Mayo did the same thing, sneaking the accused man into his car and making a run for it, unsuccessfully. Between May 5th and May 13th, following the burning of the 3 men, he made statements to the effect that he believed at least 2 of them, Cornish and Jones, were innocent. On May 13th, however, he changed his tune completely. He declared that all 3 men confessed, and that burning them alive was entirely fitting. Did he bow to community pressure and publish something he did not believe? Did he decide that opposing the powerful local Klan chapter and suggesting that innocent men were burned would not get him reelected? We will never know, but we can guess by what followed. Later that year, Mayo lost his bid for re-election. Mayo's 3 daughters were unanimous in their belief that becoming sheriff was a big mistake. His daughter Grace said he'd never been associated with the underworld. He was easily hurt and was sensitive to everything. That will make you a good person if you have the stamina to take it, but it's unfortunate my father even lived there because of the type of person he was. I think being sheriff broke his spirit. After losing the election, he struggled to find employment to support his family. A money-making prank Mayo sometimes pulled was to drive his Nash automobile erratically into one of the small communities in the county and act as though he was so intoxicated he could barely stand. Because of his reputation as a crack pistol shot, he would inevitably be challenged by 1 or more locals to a shooting contest. Mayo would stumble, mumble, and accept the challenge, then straighten up when it was his turn to fire and drill each target dead center before collecting his winnings and walking away, obviously sober. But that scheme stopped working when his fake intoxication got replaced with a real one. His spirit being broken was illustrated by his increased drinking. As daughter Laura Bess recalled, that was the only thing that gave him relief. He did that just to drown himself, so he wouldn't get so depressed thinking about how bad things were. In September 1930, he approached his friend, Jim Sessions, son of Carter Sessions, who was a candidate for sheriff. Sessions was from Curvin. When he told Sessions, "I would love to help get you elected in any way I can," Sessions quickly and firmly told him he didn't want his help. Mayo was devastated. Sessions' new dislike of Mayo was passed down to his son, who also became sheriff of Freestone County and who described Mayo 50 years later as a sorry man. The rebuff stung, and not long after it occurred, Mayo and a friend went out of the county looking for employment. They found none, and upon returning to Curvin, Mayo went to a tenant house on his farm near town. There, with the .45 caliber revolver he had carried while in office, he committed suicide.
Bless his heart, I'll tell you. Oh, we all grieved for him. And we grieved with him before he ever. We knew, in fact, in a way, if we just sort of really what we felt like that he was a Christian. And you can commit suicide if you really, because your mind has been deranged, so that you really are not responsible.
So was Mayo a hero or a villain? A law enforcement officer or a murderer? A man who stood up to a hate group or one who caved in to political pressure? Was he Hyde or was he Jekyll? Perhaps he was just an ordinary man, armored with principles and burdened by flaws, who found himself in a job and a situation beyond his capability to control. His carefree life of playing pranks, telling stories, sharing a drink with pals, and singing in the church choir was suddenly transformed into insults, accusations, and failures. He believed that by enforcing the law and protecting the innocent he would win the public's favor, but when that didn't work, he abandoned his principles in favor of being reelected. It did not take him long to learn he had made the wrong choice. The guilt of it took 8 years to devour his soul. Like so many details of this sad, twisted tale, we'll never know for certain.